So, as I said last time, when Moses goes up Mount Sinai in the priestly source, in P, he doesn't receive laws. Right? No laws are given in P at the top of the mountain. What he receives is a blueprint for the tabernacle, which is then built according to these specifications in Exodus 35 to 40. Right? So what is the tabernacle? It is the dwelling place of Yahweh. It is literally, literally a dwelling place. This is not a figurative language. This is not, some weird abstracted thing. This is where God is going to live. And it's got a bunch of stuff in it, right? It's got the ark and the table and the lampstand and the altar and an incense altar and a basin. It's got a whole bunch of stuff. And as boring as this material is to read, and it is incredibly boring to read, right? There is, I think, nothing more mind-numbing than the 6 chapters of instructions for, this many cubits of the thing and this many sockets, and they're made of this, and then and that's the instructions, and then it goes through it all again when it's actually built. It's incredibly boring. Even I think it's incredibly boring. But as boring as it is, you can't overstate the importance of this material for P, right? The construction of the tabernacle. Right? You don't go into this much excruciating detail just for nothing. This is where Yahweh will dwell in the midst of Israel now and forever, at least in principle. And this is made abundantly clear in Exodus 29, for there, and the tabernacle, I will meet with you, and there I will speak with you, and there I will meet with the Israelites, and it shall be sanctified by my presence. I will sanctify the tent of meeting and the altar. I'll consecrate them, Aaron and his sons, and I will abide among the Israelites, and I will be their God, and they shall know that I am the Lord their God, who brought them out from the land of Egypt, in order that I might abide among them. Right? In other words, God even says here, right, the reason I took them out of Egypt was so that I could dwell in their midst. And then, of course, there's all the building of it, and the tabernacle is finally finished precisely 1 year after the Exodus. So the Exodus is the beginning of the months, the first of the months of the year, and in the first month of the second year, on the first of the month, the tabernacle is set up. You'll remember, even from when we did the flood story, how much P loves calendar and nice, clean lengths of time. Also, maybe Genesis 1, and it's finished. And God, Yahweh, takes his place in the tabernacle. And at this moment, the tabernacle replaces Sinai as the locus of the divine presence. Right, the cloud back at Sinai covered the mountain, and the presence of the Lord dwelt there. And now that the tent is up, the cloud covers the tent, and the presence of the Lord fills it. Okay. Once the tabernacle has been set up, and this is sensible given what I just said, once the tabernacle is set up, God no longer speaks to Moses from the mountain, as he did before. Now Yahweh speaks from the tabernacle, right, or the tent of meeting, which are in P the same thing. Again, only the tabernacle instructions are given on Sinai. The laws of P are given from the tabernacle at the foot of the mountain. Now, I am going to deal with Leviticus 17 through 26 separately for reasons to be discussed next time. But from the moment that God starts talking in Leviticus 1 until the end in Numbers 10, which is what you were read for today, the entirety of this legislation takes up a book and a half of the Bible. Right? It's an enormous amount of text. But it only takes chronologically a month and 20 days. Right? Remember that from Genesis 1 up until Exodus 40, which, when we take out the stuff that isn't P, is actually a smaller amount of text, that's thousands of years, right? So we can think about the way that the narrative speeds up and slows down as a marker of what's important, right? Thousands of years, takes us from Genesis 1 to the end of Exodus, and then we come to a grinding halt, and a month of time is taken with an entire book and a half, right? Which demonstrates the centrality of the laws for P. This stuff is the point. Right? And this is the entirety of what happens at Sinai in the priestly story. There is no covenant ceremony, there's no tablets, there's no golden calf. Right? It is the building of the tabernacle and the giving of the laws in Leviticus. And I want to take today to explain to you the priestly system, worldview. Because amid all of the mind-numbing detail, and it is mind-numbing, the system that P is constructing isn't obvious, right? We get distracted by trying to sift through, what are these little rituals and the blood and where does it go and like the animals and all the things. It's a lot of trees, and we often miss the forest. But in fact, the system that P is constructing here is actually it's remarkable. I think it's even beautiful, and it's worth understanding. Without necessarily getting into all of the nitty-gritty of how long can that one sacrifice sit out over, can it be overnight? It's not important right now. I'm gonna sort of try and see this from a bird's eye view and see if I can explain it to you. And we're gonna walk through it a little bit. So the this is the slide that shows you it's a month and 20 days. That's not so important. The first 3 chapters of Leviticus are about free will sacrifices. That is, sacrifices you can bring anytime you like. And there are 3 kinds, right? There are burnt offerings, whether from the herd or the flock or a bird, right? These offerings, as their name suggests, are entirely consumed in fire. They are, in a sense, the highest form of the sacrifice, right? They are entirely dedicated to the deity. No one else gets a single bit of it. I will note here that despite what in your translations may look like a gendered language, like as if only men bring sacrifices, that's absolutely not the case. Within the priestly system, anybody can and should bring offerings. Men and women are, in the sense, ritually equal for the purposes of offering sacrifices. So there's burnt offerings. There are grain offerings, which are themselves also entirely consumed in the fire, which are basically the poorer person's equivalent of the whole burnt offering, right? I can't afford a cow. I'd like to bring something. Okay, so you can bring some grain. It's not very expensive. The gesture is the same. The third category is the well-being offering, for which I wish there were a better word in English, but there's not. Peace offering, sometimes they're called, because the Hebrew is from the word shalom, shlamim sacrifices. So peace offering sometimes comes up, even though peace has nothing to do with it. Right, shalom doesn't really mean peace the way we mean it. It really means well-being, right? It's how you say, how are you doing? So well-being offerings, some part of which are burned, right, for the deity, and some of which are consumed by the priests, and some of which are consumed by the person making the offering, and that's important, right? Because if you have a cow and you want to eat some of it, this is basically the only way to do it. Right? The only way for you to consume the meat of sacrificial animals, which is meat from herds and flocks and birds, is to bring it to the sanctuary, to offer it as a sacrifice, and to get some of that meat back. And this is the kind of sacrifice we see actually all over the Bible, not just in the priestly text. And this is true of the burnt offering too. The burnt offering and the well-being offering are the 2 types of sacrifices that exist everywhere in the Bible. Everyone knows about them. They're totally standard. And the sacrifice of well-being is the one that you bring at a festival, right? Everyone comes to the sanctuary and offers their offering, and they kind of have a big party. In this material we just read before this, right, when the Israelites do a covenant ceremony and they do offerings, then they eat and drink, right? That kind of offering, right? They sacrifice some, they get some meat back, and they eat. All three of these types that we have here, again, totally, with the exception of it's a festival and you're supposed to do whatever you're supposed to do. At any time, you could bring these, Right? You could bring these anytime you want as a gesture of reverence or appreciation or thanks or, hey, could you do a thing for me, God, whatever it may be, right? These are anytime you want to, you can do it. And this is the first major aspect of the sacrificial system, right? People bringing gifts as an act of service and worship. Pretty straightforward. But only 3 chapters are dealing with it because, in fact, everybody pretty much got that bit. Right? Like, that part's easy. The harder part is what comes next and is laid out in far greater depth because it actually has much more important consequences. Starting in chapter 4, we get sacrifices that are offered when you've committed some sort of a violation. You've done something wrong. The first category is what are called, I'm going to call purification offerings, and in your Bibles you will inevitably see as sin offerings, and I will get to why that's a bad translation momentarily. But these offerings are brought when you have inadvertently transgressed some sort of ritual prohibition. Right? If, for example, you didn't know that something wasn't allowed and you did it anyway, but then you found out it was forbidden, and you were like, ooh, I need to bring an offering to make up for it. And in the course of this, in the course of this law, we are given the ritual offerings presented in decreasing order of importance of the sinner. So first we get like, what if it's the high priest who does this? Okay, well, he's got to bring like a pretty big sacrifice. What if it's the entire community that does this? Also a pretty big sacrifice. What if it's a chieftain? What if it's like any normal person, right? In decreasing order of how much you have to sort of pay for your sin. You'll note that it's not just how important you are, but how close you are to the sanctuary, right? If you're the high priest and you have committed some sort of sin, you got to really, you got to bring like some pretty good stuff to make up for that, because you are like right there, man, like, and so on. The second category is what I would call reparation offerings, which is the second one here, which are offered for consciously or unconsciously trespassing against the sacred sphere. So, you accidentally grabbed hold of some sacred object that you weren't supposed to, right? Or you knocked over the altar and you broke it. You can't knock over the altar, it's much too big. But you know what I mean, same idea. But this category also includes, for example, swearing falsely by Yahweh's name, because Yahweh's name is also a sacred thing, right? And you have misused it, right? So think of this as sins for misuse of sacred objects, right? And again, all under the categories you can see here of unintentional sins, right? You've done something, but you didn't mean to, or you didn't know you weren't supposed to. You found out later. Unintentional sins. I'll get back to intentional sins briefly in a bit. Okay. So 2 major categories of sacrifices. Free will offerings, bring it whenever you like, and offerings you have to bring for given circumstances. And that's 1 through 3 is the first category, 4 through 5 is the second, and then in 6 and 7 we get the detailed, sometimes repetitive rituals for all of these kinds of sacrifices. The burnt offering, the meal offering, the sin offering, which as I said is better purification offering, the guilt offering, which is what I called the reparation offering, right, and the well-being offering. All of the violations that are described in chapters 4 and 5, right, the unintentional violations, and the sacrifices that we are described in these chapters, provide something that is usually translated as atonement or expiation. So what is atonement or expiation? It's not what we mean today. Right? When the Bible says, and therefore with the sacrifice you have achieved atonement, it's not the way we use that word today. In practical terms, atonement or expiation is achieved by the placing of sacrificial blood on some part of the sanctuary. That's how this happens, right? How do you achieve atonement? You place blood, right? Either you pour a little bit, or you flick a little bit, or you dab a little bit. You can go beyond the altar or inside, right? And these are the details I'm not really getting into, depending on the type of sin and the type of sacrifice. But that's how it's achieved, right? You can only achieve atonement by applying blood to the sanctuary, which should make us sit up and be like, well, that doesn't seem to make sense with anything I know about what atonement would be. Like, why would that have anything to do with the other? And the answer is, what's happening when you apply blood to the sanctuary in various places and ways is that the divine dwelling place, remember this is God's home, the divine dwelling place is thereby ritually purged of the contamination that has accumulated there. So think of blood, think of sacrificial blood, in a phrase that is now relatively common in scholarship and is a wonderful one, as ritual detergent. Right? God's home, Yahweh's home, the sanctuary, has become contaminated, and sacrificial blood cleans it, purges it. Contamination of the sanctuary comes from acts of ritual wrongdoing, from sinning, and also from impurities, which we'll get to momentarily. Sins and impurities make the sanctuary dirty. They contaminate it. They sort of accumulate in the sanctuary, and if they are allowed to collect there, it's like God's house is getting dirtier and dirtier, right? And what happens if God's house gets too dirty? God is like, bye-bye, right? And God leaves his home, which is a terrible thing, right? Again, right? The whole story here was we came to Sinai and built God a home, right? That was the purpose of the Exodus. So I may dwell in the midst of the Israelites, and if you let God's house get too dirty, God will leave, thereby undoing all of that. And of course, when God leaves, there goes all of your divine protection and and beneficence and all of those things. So God's departure is a threat to the whole community, for the whole community. So this is a system of ritual cleaning that keeps God's house tidy and thereby keeps God in it. So atonement, the way we use it today, is a pretty bad translation, right? Purgation is better, right? That's what these sacrifices achieve: purgation or purification or cleaning. And this is an important point. In these rituals, what's being cleaned? Not the person who committed the sin. Sins don't make you unclean. Sins don't contaminate you. Sins contaminate the sanctuary. So the sacrifices don't purify you. They purify the sanctuary on your behalf. You did something, this isn't so hard, right? Like, I always use analogies involving kids because I have them and they always work. Not my kids, they don't always work. Right? If my kid knocks something over in the kitchen, she's not dirty. The kitchen's dirty. And if the milk sits there on the floor, it's going to get gross. And I need her to clean it up. I don't need her to clean herself up. Right? Like, that's fine. Just take responsibility for the thing that you did. Clean it up, and then we'll all be good. That's the principle here, right? It's not the person who sinned that needs cleaning. It's the sanctuary that was contaminated that needs cleaning. So the sacrificial system here exists in order to maintain the cleanliness of the deity's house. And the priestly authors understood this as a system that works, right? It functions. It's service and maintenance, right? There is nothing mystical or esoteric about the sacrificial system. It's thoroughly practical. Thoroughly practical. The entirety of Exodus 25 through Numbers 10 in the priestly text centers around the divine dwelling, the divine abode. In Exodus 25 through 40, we have its construction and inhabitation. And in the sacrificial system, we have how do you maintain it? How do we maintain it? So the first thing we do is have the tabernacle established, right? the place where the sacrifices happen. Then we have the sacrifices laid out in detail in chapters 1 through 7. And then we get to who it is that's doing the sacrifices, right? The priests. So Leviticus 8, we get the consecration of Aaron and of his sons, which follows the instructions of Exodus 29, basically word for word. But we might ask, like, if in Exodus 29 Moses was already instructed to do this, why didn't he do it before now? Like when he did all the other instructions in Leviticus 25 through 30? And the answer is, in order to consecrate the priests, you need to offer a bunch of sacrifices. So first we need to know what the sacrifices are and how they're done, and then we can get to doing them. Right? You have to give the rules for the sacrifices before you can carry out the sacrifices. Right? It's logical. Right? P gives information in the order necessary almost all the time. Okay, so we consecrate the priests, who are not actually very different from like the other stuff in the tabernacle. Right? They are kind of sacred furniture. Right? But their job is to clean up everything in the sanctuary. I have here and there referred to the priests as the equivalent of the what's the thing called? Roomba for the sanctuary, right? Like they like move around on their own, but like they've got, you give them their instructions and they go around and they clean it up. They're also sort of furniture. After the consecration of the priests, we get revelation in Leviticus 9. We get the first sacrifices offered by these newly consecrated priests. Right? Moses says to Aaron, all right, friend, I've been sort of handling this in the interim because there weren't any priests around, but now you're consecrated and it's on you. Right? Come on forward and sacrifice your sin offering, again, purification offering, and your burnt offering, making expiation, right? Purging, purifying, not yourself, but for yourself and for the people, right? This isn't about cleaning you. It's about cleaning up any messes that you and the people are responsible for, right, as God has commanded. These are the first sacrifices that occur really just about anywhere in the priestly source. Remember, P doesn't have any sacrifice before there's a sanctuary. And this is all in preparation for the appearance of Yahweh to the people. The presence of Yahweh appears in the entrance of the tabernacle, and fire comes out from within the tabernacle and ignites the altar and consumes the sacrifices that were placed on it. And this moment is the climax of the divine theophany according to P, right? It comes in 3 stages. First, the appearance on the top of Sinai, right? And then once the tabernacle is built, the entrance into the tabernacle. And now, finally, third, the beginning of proper sacrificial worship. This moment, Leviticus 9, is the climax, right? God has had his house built and is dwelling in his house and now has inaugurated the priestly cult that is so important and central. And as soon as that's done, transgression. Right? That's super funny. Everything's happening at once now. Okay, so we have the story, obviously, here of Nadav and Avihu, who are, famously consumed in fire for their transgression here. We might ask ourselves, what exactly did they do wrong? They are, after all, priests, right? They are Aaron's sons. They brought an offering. What's so bad here? And the answer is, having just received instructions for the entire sacrificial system, how sacrifices work, when they should be brought, suddenly we have priests who are like, I'm going to bring a sacrifice just because I feel like it. Like, that's not what's happening here. Sacrifices, the sacrificial system exists for a purpose, right? And the purpose has nothing to do with the priests themselves, right? The priests themselves are not like, they're special people, but they're not more important or sort of higher ranked in some way. Like they should be able to bring sacrifices whenever they want to. The sacrificial system exists as a public good, right? Sacrifices exist for the Israelites as a whole, for the maintaining of God in his sanctuary. You bring your own sacrifice just for fun, and it looks like a sort of act of self-aggrandizement almost, right? It's for you. That's for you. It wasn't needed, right? Sacrifice is supposed to be needed. So they bring an incense offering when no incense offering was ordered, right? Reminding us, right? Only that which is prescribed is legitimate. Anything else is sacrilege. Right? They're lighting the fire. They're doing all sorts of things wrong. The basic issue here is the ritual instructions must be followed precisely. Right? I just gave you chapters of detailed rules about this. Must be followed precisely. Ritual crimes are serious stuff. They're not just technicalities, right? The divine presence in the tabernacle depends upon the proper worship. And so we get a very early lesson in this, right? From the people who are as close as possible to this, right? Aaron's own sons. If they are screwing it up, and this is what happens, you, normal Israelite, probably should pay attention to get it right. Okay. Having established all of that, we then jump into what feels like a slightly different world, which is we get the kosher laws right off the bat. These are the creatures that you may eat and not. Remember that according to P, all meat and vegetation was given to humans for food really early on, right? All the vegetation was given in Genesis 1, and all of the animals were given after the flood. And the only prohibition from then until now was you can't eat the blood of an animal, right? No consuming of the blood, right? Which now actually kind of makes sense because we realize that animal blood has like a purpose, right, for the sanctuary. These laws that we have here suddenly in Leviticus 11 are new restrictions, and they are exclusively for the Israelites. And they cover the entirety of the animal kingdom as described in Genesis 1. Large land animals and fish and birds and flying insects and small land animals, right, each category of which is divided into clean and unclean. And in this way, the Israelites are essentially maintaining the dietary restrictions that correspond to the divisions of the natural world as created back in Genesis 1. Just as, we might point out, I'll jump back here for a second, just as they are supposed to maintain temporal restrictions corresponding to the natural divisions of time established back in Genesis 1. Right? In other words, right, and I said this back when we were looking at Genesis 1 too, I think, like that Genesis 1 establishes categories, separations of time, separations of animals, categories of things that make virtually no impact on anything until now. Right? So creation looks ahead to this moment, to the moment when Israel receives laws that have them do something interesting and important with these natural divisions from creation. And this is how Israel, of course, is now kept separate from the rest of humanity, who are all bound, according to its own text, by sort of the more general rules. So again, right, it's very nice for God to say at creation, right, seventh day, is sacred or separate somehow, but how? Only Israel knows how, or knows what to do with it, or gets these instructions about what to do with it. Same too with the kosher laws. Not only are there things you can't eat, there's things you can't touch. Right? So contact with carcasses of animals, even animals you can eat, right, creates impurity, unclean. Unclean and impure are the same word in Hebrew. Or rather, we use those two words to translate that one word. Okay. So now that we're introduced to the concept of impurity, I'm going to tell you what impurity is, because it's also super not obvious, right? It's a entirely foreign concept to us, but it's very important. And I need to distinguish first between two complementary dualities, two binaries, sacred and profane, and pure and impure, because these things often get muddled in our minds. Sacred means having to do with God, belonging to God, God's name, God's house, the stuff in God's house, the sacrifices you give to God, God's Roombas, the priests. Right? Those things are all sacred. Everything else is profane, non-sacred. And sacred and profane are mostly unchangeable categories. Right? A sacred thing basically is always sacred, and a profane thing is always profane, and it takes some major ritual act for that to change. Right? This animal is profane until I say, I sacrifice this animal, and then it is sacred. Right? A priest, at least Aaron, for example, was profane, normal dude, until he was anointed as priest, and now he's sacred. Right? And he's always going to be sacred from now on. So sacred is always sacred, profane is always profane. Pure and impure, however, are mutable categories. They're changeable. An item, whether it's a person or an animal or a vessel or a piece of clothing or a house, right, can change states from pure to impure and back again. So purity is a fluctuating kind of state. And the big danger in this world is that the sacred become tinged with the impure. That's the thing that we don't want to happen. So, what is impurity? I return to the question. Impurity is essentially an invisible, though very real, coating, which pollutes that which it touches and communicates its own degrees of impurity depending on how strong it is. Impurity is not dirt. It's not an infection. It's not evil or demonic. It's just a fact of life. Certain things are just naturally sources of impurity. And we can tell that, right, there's no moral condemnation or sinfulness or evil about impurity, right? You become impure when you give birth. Not a bad thing. You become impure when you have sex. Not a bad thing, right? You become impure when you get ill in certain ways. Not a bad thing, right? There's nothing wrong with it, right? You get impure when a rat dies in your oven and you have to remove it. Not a bad thing, like probably a pretty good thing, right? Like, in fact, almost all the things that create impurity are totally fine. Like, if your horse keels over dead, you've got to do something with the body of that horse. Right? That's not a bad thing. It just makes you impure. When you bury your parent, you become impure. It's not even like not a bad thing. It's like you're commanded to do that. You have to do that. So we want to keep morality out of the conversation when we're talking about impurity. And remember, given everything I just said, there's no prohibition against becoming impure. Everyone in ancient Israel was constantly impure. It's a little early in the day, but I bet some of you are already impure. Right? And we all become impure almost every day, constantly impure. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with being impure. There's no prohibition against it. The prohibition is against remaining impure. Right? Because if you become impure and then you don't do anything about it, like a sin, your impurity spreads to contaminate the tabernacle, the sanctuary. For whatever reason, impurity, like sin, is sort of drawn to the sanctuary. It's attracted to it, and it adheres to it, and it accumulates there. And this is why the only people in all of Israel who have to really try to actively avoid impurity are the priests. Because again, they're right there. Right? Their impurity is going to instantly contaminate. Yours may take a little time to migrate. Everybody else other than priests, all you have to do is make sure to get rid of your impurity when you get it. So again, what are the things that cause impurity? That's what we learn in Leviticus 11 through 15, right? It's things that, I don't love trying to abstract it into some big category, but generally, things that represent the escape of life forces. So human corpses and animal carcasses and the effluence of life fluids, be it semen or menstrual fluid or the blood of childbirth or other types of genital discharge, right? Certain diseases, right? Especially ones that visually replicate the effects of death. So the escape of life forces seems to be in the background. You'll note that like human waste is not impure because it has nothing to do with the escape of life forces. Blood isn't impure, even though it obviously has something to do with the escape of life force. But that's because blood has already been categorized as something different. Right? Blood is the ritual detergent. Right? It's the agent of purification. So blood is not a source of impurity. So what gets rid of impurity? Let's say you picked up there was a dead rat in your oven, and you were like, I gotta get rid of this thing, and you picked it up by the tail and you threw it in the trash, whatever. What do you do now? How do you get rid of the impurity you just contracted? You wait a little bit until night falls and you take a bath. Congratulations, you have just gotten rid of your impurity, right? So time and bathing purify your individuals from most minor impurities. Right? Just goes away by itself. And I will have the brief aside here to note that it is because of this that historically, especially in periods where this wasn't so much the case everywhere, Jewish people have generally had a higher level of hygiene than many of their neighbors. Probably not true anymore. But it was true, for example, in the Middle Ages, when Jews were ritually bathing to get rid of their impurities on a regular basis. And thus, for example, when the Black Plague hit, and they were more hygienic than their neighbors, Jews survived at a higher rate. Which sounds awesome, except that the non-Jews were all like, well, clearly they caused it with their Jew magic, and killed us, right? So like, there's, this like funny little like impurity system actually had like pretty terrible real-world ramifications at a certain points in history. That's a brief aside. So the minor impurities, again, all you have to do is bathe. And so like, that's easy enough. You take a bath every day and you can be sure that even if you didn't know about it, the impurities you've acquired over the course of the day are now taken care of and gone. The problem is obviously if you don't do the cleaning, don't do the hygiene, then your impurities accumulate. Now it's getting worse. Major impurities, which are the ones that aren't solved by just bathing, which include things like childbirth, which include things like certain kinds of skin disease, right? These contaminate both you're impure, and the tabernacle, right? They're pretty bad. And again, when the sanctuary is contaminated with your impurity, you've got to clean it up. You didn't do anything wrong. Like just like when you sinned, like you didn't mean to do anything wrong. But okay, you had a child, definitely didn't do anything wrong. But the impurity caused by that is severe enough that it contaminates the tabernacle. What do you do about it? What do you think you do? You offer this offering, right? Which offering? The one that's called the sin offering, which is why that's a terrible name. You didn't commit a sin. It's a purification offering, because that's what it does. It purifies. So you offer this purification sacrifice, and thereby you clean it. So again, even in this whole world of impurity, that is in part about you and how you become impure, what it's really about is keeping Yahweh's home clean, right? Your impurities can contaminate the tabernacle, and if they didn't, the priests wouldn't give a damn about them, but they do, so here's how you clean it up. You offer your sacrifices. The divine dwelling place is the focus of all of these laws. Okay. When we get to Leviticus 16, it's one of my favorite chapters in the entirety of the Bible, we get what's called the Day of Atonement today. It's not called that in the Bible. How does this day work? It is not in the Bible a day when we ask God for forgiveness for our sins and ask our friends for forgiveness for our sins against them, and then we all have bagels, right? That's not, like the two Jews in the room thought that was funny. Okay. Someday you'll be invited. Okay. How does the Day of Atonement work? How does this ritual, this Leviticus 16 ritual work? Over the course of the year, as we've just described, contamination accumulates in the sanctuary. Now, we've just given you all of the rituals for how to clean up your contamination. So in theory, if everyone, like, every time they become impure, they do an offering, it's not that dirty. Every time they sin and they realize it, it's not that dirty. They clean it up. But what if you sinned and nobody ever told you and you never found out? Sin's still there. What if you became impure and you never realized it? Impurity's still there. So these things accumulate in the sanctuary over time. And that's just the what is the word I'm looking for? Non-intentional? Unintentional. You know, words are hard. Unintentional sins, that is all we've been talking about. What about deliberate sins? What if I meant to do something and I knew it was wrong? Well, man, that is bad, right? Intentional sins, like, contaminate the innermost sanctum of the sanctuary, right? Right where God really dwells, right? And you can't clean that area with the usual methods. It's like the stain is too deep, right? Your ritual detergent doesn't clean it up. So every so often, the sanctuary, including the innermost sanctum, right, where God literally dwells, has to be cleaned. Has to be cleaned up, right? Think of it as spring cleaning, or in this case, fall cleaning. So how does that happen? First, Aaron has to offer a bull as the purification offering for himself and for his family, right? Aaron has to take care of himself and his own before he can take care of everybody else. And that's routinely the case, right? The priest has to be right in terms of having cleaned up his own mess before he can clean up other people's, which again, as a parent, makes sense to me, right? If we all make messes, I'll clean up mine and then tell them to clean up theirs. Then Aaron sacrifices a goat as a purification offering for the Israelites. In both of these rituals, with the purification offering, Aaron is going to bring the blood into the very innermost sanctum, right? God's bedroom, as it were. And to do so, Aaron creates a cloud of incense in front of the ark so that he doesn't see God sitting there. Right? That's the purpose of the incense. And then sprinkles the blood of the sacrifice in front of and around the divine throne, that is the areas most sacred and most in danger of impurity. And by doing these things, and this is the climax of the thing, right? By doing these things, thus he shall purge the shrine, that is the tabernacle, of the uncleanness and transgression of the Israelites, whatever their sins. So again, to be clear, what's the purpose of this ritual? It's the cleaning of the tabernacle, of God's home. Okay, then having gotten the inside clean, he goes out and does the same thing on the big altar outside, right? Smartly sweeping from inside to outside, right, as we all should learn to do, if anybody sweeps anymore. So we've done the inside and the outside, but all we can clean up in these ways, remember, all we can clean up is unintentional sins, right? This is the purification offering. It's only good for unintentional sins. Now we've got to deal with intentional sins. How? Scapegoat, which is not a word in the Bible. It's just a goat. But this is, of course, where the word scapegoat comes from, is from this story, from this law. So Aaron now lays his hands on a live goat and transfers Israel's sins onto it. Again, not their impurities. We took care of that. Not their unintentional sins. We took care of those. Their deliberate sins. The deliberate sins, the ones which cannot be destroyed, cannot be removed with the ritual detergent, right? They can only be sort of placed onto this animal, which is then sent off to Azazel, who is a goat-like demon who inhabits the wilderness. And if you have a problem with Israel or the Bible telling us about a goat demon in the wilderness, that's your problem, not the Bible's. But what's happening here is the sins of the people are being sent out, right? Like out of the camp, beyond civilization, into an area that is not a threat to Yahweh. It's not Yahweh's territory, reminding us that, in this concept, there is a defined limit to Yahweh's territory, right? You can send something beyond it, and out into the wilderness it goes. And these sins now become the property of some non-Israelite entity. Really, they just disappear. The goat's not killed, right? Just wanders off, right? And that takes care of it. And finally, Aaron offers burnt offerings for himself and the people. That's a fairly standard conclusion to most ritual ceremonies. Now, in its original formulation, this ritual is to happen Anytime. Anytime Aaron thinks it's necessary, he can go do this ritual. Notice, everything that's just been said requires no one to participate other than Aaron and somebody who's leading a goat to the wilderness. Right? This can happen whenever. If the high priest feels like the sanctuary has gotten contaminated, how would he know? Maybe because things aren't going so well for the people as a whole, right? So God must be getting angry. Why does God get angry in this worldview? Because his tabernacle is contaminated. Let's clean it up. So Aaron could do this whenever, right? Could do it, on a Tuesday, and then again on a Thursday if things are right. There's no time stamp on it. A later author, and I'll come back to who this later author is next time, but a later author then said, no, you know what? It's not a whenever. It's an annual thing, and adds this chunk at the end. And the chunk says, we're going to do this annually, right? On the 10th day of the 7th month. So instead of a ad hoc, it needs to be cleaned, it becomes the sort of annual fall cleaning. And the people are now more involved. And actually, you can see here, if you look carefully, the sort of difference conceptually between this and what we've seen before. Right? Notice, on this day, atonement shall be made for you to cleanse you of your sins. What? That's not how this ever worked before. Right? This is a new understanding of how sin works and how cleaning works. And this is why, because now you're involved. It's not just the tabernacle being cleaned, it's you too. You're not there for it. So since you're not there for this thing that's being done on your behalf, you have to fast. Right? That's how you sort of participate from afar. And this day represents individual and communal catharsis, and the sins and the impurity of the Israelites are removed, and equilibrium with the deity and his dwelling place are restored. Okay, I recognize how short I am on time, and I still got some stuff to go, so I'm going to go fast, and you're going to like it. So we're going to skip. Fortunately, we're skipping all of Leviticus 17 through 26. I'm doing it on Wednesday. We're jumping ahead then to Numbers 1. And again, we're following the original order of the events according to P, right? So far, from Exodus 25, we've had the construction of the divine dwelling place, the inhabitation of the divine dwelling place, the instructions for maintaining the divine dwelling on a regular basis, which is to say the sacrifices. We've had the beginning of worship, marked by the fire emerging from the divine dwelling place. We've got the rule as to what endangers the divine dwelling place, that is impurity laws. And we've had the ritual for thoroughly cleaning the divine dwelling place. Now we are told at the beginning of Numbers how the Israelites are arranged around the divine dwelling place. Okay, so first we have to take a census for military purposes, right? All those who bear arms. So we take a census, and then the tribes are arranged in a square encompassing the tabernacle. Right, so they're arranged around it, some to the north, some to the south, etc., right, as if they're being prepared to march to war with the ark among them. There is, however, one tribe distinct from the others. That's the Levites, of course. They are not recorded in the census because they are exempt from fighting, and the census is a military process. And the Levites encamp directly around the tabernacle, right? They're like the inner ring around it, in the midst of the other tribes. They are, in the priestly conception, Levites are essentially priestly servants, right? They are in charge of physically moving the tabernacle, right? When it needs to move, they pack it up and move it. And so they get a separate recording and a separate division into various subunits, doing their various parts of this responsibility. Each sort of family of the Levites has a specific part of the tabernacle they are responsible for. But again, according to P, the Levites are basically like they're servants for the priests, right? For the tabernacle at the very least. All right, that's Numbers 1 through 4. Then in 5 and 6, we get two pretty random laws. We get this odd, complicated law of the suspected adulteress in Numbers 5, which, if you read it carefully, is basically like a water ordeal, right, where we see if witches float, right? That's what it is, right? The priest takes holy water, mixes it with dirt from the floor of the tabernacle, gross, says some curses over it, writes down the curses, mixes that writing in with the water, then the woman drinks the water, and if she gets sick, it means she was unfaithful. And if she doesn't, by some miracle, get sick, then she's cleared. Right? This is nonsense and ridiculous and completely unfair to the woman. And it's in your Bibles. So, figure out how you want, this is all I can say about it, figure out how to deal with this kind of stuff in your biblical text. We'll be talking about this later in other ways. But there it is. And then in number 6, we get the law of the Nazirite vow, which is essentially, you're famously known from Samson. Basically, you agree not to drink or shave, and you stay away from impurity, right? You're sort of priestly in that way. You sort of sacralize yourself. And then once your term as Nazirite is over, you present a series of offering. What actually happens while you're a Nazirite? I don't know. Not clear. Evidently, you marry a bunch of terrible women and then knock over a temple if you're Samson. I don't know. We'll get there later. The Nazirite vow is actually pretty mysterious. But it does seem to have something to do with making yourself into a sacred object. Okay, we're getting there. We get to the end of the priestly legislation at Sinai in number 7. The tabernacle is done. Its laws are in place. In number 7, the chieftains of the Israelite tribes bring offerings to the tabernacle in what, if you actually tried to read through it, is the single weirdest, worst, most boring, repetitive chapter in the entire Bible, bar none. It's just each one of the tribes bringing the exact same thing over and over. It's 89 verses of hell. Okay. And then Numbers 8, the Levites are formally consecrated as priestly servants. And now we have reached, in Numbers 9, in time, a year and a month from the Exodus. That's where we are. But the narrator has to backtrack a little because something has happened during that year that requires our attention. Right? If we've gone a year and a month since the Exodus, that means that we have passed Passover. Right? The celebration of Passover. Right? They should have celebrated. And we're told in Numbers 9 that they did. Right? Moses instructed the Israelites to offer the Passover, and they did so on the 14th day of the month, just like they're supposed to. Terrific. But in the meantime, we added a concept to our understanding of the world, which is impurity. And we learned, right, if you're impure, you are not allowed to go anywhere near the sacred things, right? Impurity forbids you from going into the tabernacle or offering sacrifices. So what happens if Passover time comes and you are told you have to offer the sacrifice, but you're impure? Okay, new law, right? Here are some people who are impure, like they buried someone. What are they supposed to do? Right? We create a new law. People who are impure at the time of the Passover sacrifice can do it exactly a month later. And that's exactly what happens. Here we are, 1 year and 1 month later, and they offer what's called the second Passover, and now we're like all cut up. And after the second Passover, it is time to leave Sinai. Right? The signal for when to travel and when to stop is based on, shockingly, the tabernacle, the divine dwelling place. When the cloud descends on the tent, the Israelites stop. When the cloud lifts, the Israelites follow it. The Israelites have no control over when and where they go. They go where the tent and the tabernacle and the cloud tell them to. And once the protocol is in place for how to move, the Israelites can actually go. And here finally we've reached Numbers 10. So what is all of this about, Numbers 1 through 10? The arrangement of the Israelite tribes around the divine abode, the means by which the divine dwelling is protected, the means by which it's moved, the way in which the divine dwelling place determines every movement of the Israelites. In other words, it's still all about the divine dwelling place. That's what all of this stuff is. And this is the essence of Sinai 4P, the preparation of the divine dwelling place for worship. Sinai 4P is about God's presence in the midst of his people Israel. Everything the Israelites do, really everything, including eating and having sex, everything has an impact on God's presence in their community. And in that way, every act is made meaningful because every act participates in the obligation to keep God in Israel's midst. Everything you do, you are responsible for. Right? If you do something wrong, you're responsible for cleaning it up, not for your own sake, for the sake of your whole community and everyone around you. Individual responsibility for communal well-being, right? The way that idea is expressed in these chapters is incredibly boring. It's boring and difficult and foreign to us, but the idea itself isn't. The idea itself isn't only comprehensible, it's inspired. Right? And it's relevant, right? The worldview underneath the priestly text is so good, right? And so thoughtful and so modern in its sense. individual responsibility for communal well-being. You have to be able to read it, right? Generically, you have to be able to read the genre of ritual text to get to it. But once you get past all the tiny little details, there's something really big and good there. Okay, I'm way over time. I will we'll move on and do more next time. Thanks.